very warm welcome to the World Economic Forum DW debate coming to you from Naypyidaw, the capital of Myanmar. Who would have thought just a year ago that we'd be all gathered here in this country on the threshold of great change? A country which is currently facing huge problems, but also hopes to be part of the success story of Southeast Asia. Now, economic prospects in Southeast Asia remain extremely bright, but we also know now that lack of proper infrastructure is a big drag on growth, which could be even higher and more inclusive. So what do we need to do to power growth through strategic infrastructure? What actions, what innovations do we need to realize the full economic potential of Southeast Asia? To discuss that, we have a distinguished panelist for you here, starting with Stephen P. Groff, who's the Vice President of the Asian Development Bank based in Manila. Shahril Shamsuddin, President and Group CEO of SapuraKencana Petroleum from Malaysia. Hamish Tyrwhitt, Chief Executive Officer, Leighton Holdings, based in Australia. John Rice, Vice Chairman, GE Hong Kong, who's also the co-chair of the World Economic Forum East Asia. And Gita Wirjawan, the Minister of Trade from Indonesia. A warm welcome to all of you. Now, you could give them a hand, of course. It makes Right, Stephen, let me start with you. Now, you have a very broad overview of the region through your work with the Asian Development Bank, especially in infrastructure. What do you think needs, what are the infrastructure needs in your assessment of this region to unleash its full economic potential?
Well, Amrita, first, thanks for having me here today. I mean, I think we all know that the needs of the region are huge. Our estimates for developing Asia the needs are somewhere on the order of about $750 billion a year between now and 2020. So those are huge, and those are a range of different infrastructure areas such as transport and communications and energy supply. But the other part of it, of course, is that we need to see interconnectedness between Southeast Asian countries in particular increasing. And right now, the connections, the transport connections, the telecommunication connections, the energy supply connections between countries in Southeast Asia are insufficient to meet the kind of demand, to meet the kind of growth rates that we want to see propelling the region through for the coming decades.
Thank you, Stephen. John, your company, GE, has been involved in ASEAN for over 100 years. How important is the role of the private sector in unleashing the potential of this region through investments in infrastructure?
Well, I think it's very important. I think when you look at the challenge of providing infrastructure for a growing population, a growing middle class that really wants better things, you need private companies and the technology they bring. You need private capital, and then you need capacity and capability creation. I mean, you have to be able to train people and help them become better leaders, and it's really the kind of things that you do for a country that we would do in GE for our own people.
Right. Now, obviously, Hamish, your company is an engineering and a company which has been involved in infrastructure in Asia for several decades. You're also a member of the World Economic Forum's Infrastructure Steering Committee. What areas would you highlight in infrastructure development which are key for the region?
I think the first thing is to understand what was that committee formed for and why. And if you look at the major challenges that have taken place post the GFC really is that the burden of rolling out infrastructure, or the responsibility of rolling out infrastructure, cannot rest just with governments alone. Various fiscal constraints mean that we've seen a huge shortfall, and the global shortfall of infrastructure development is around about $1 trillion. So at the World Economic Forum, the Board of Governors and the infrastructure sector has really been working on trying to unlock the issues that are causing that deficit. So we're looking at prioritising projects, we're looking at better allocation of risks between the public and private sector, and finally, how do we access this huge amount of private funding that is out there, and really bringing that public-private partnership together to fund this infrastructure deficit.
Thank you. Shahril, now you are the owner of one of the biggest companies, oil and gas integrated services companies based in Malaysia. Do you think that energy is the biggest infrastructure issue facing the region? And if so, what needs to be addressed most urgently?
I would echo to say it is a very critical component of development, because energy will drive all the other developments that is required, and it's not just energy, but the interlink and the dynamic that goes on the different components as transport, education, security, and a strong legal infrastructure. Because when all of this comes together, then you'll also attract investment into the region. And one of the things that we have to be mindful about this area is that different countries are at different levels of development. I would propose a joint development on infrastructure itself, because that will be effective use of capital. At the same time, I would also like to underscore the point that in developing any of these facets, especially energy, it's also an opportunity to build capabilities locally. I think John mentioned about capability building and building a middle class. These projects are huge. It's an opportunity to train capabilities, to grow the middle class in this area, which is on the demand side of whatever is produced after the energy and the transport and telecommunications. Without the development of both in tandem, you may disintermediate certain classes of people, and it will not be as sustainable. So I guess I would add to that it would be a prudent policy that encourages all of this to happen in tandem.
Thank you, Shahril. Gita, most of the big infrastructure projects in the world, or particularly in Asia, are in the hands of the government. What kind of actions and innovations can the government actually take or make to make infrastructure more effective in this region?
Well, I think, let me speak on behalf of ASEAN. We take a look at ASEAN on the yardstick of just about everything in the infrastructure play, whether it's the degree of electrification, the number of kilometers of roads on a per 1,000 persons basis, number of kilometers of railroads on a per 1,000 person basis, and the telephony and all that. ASEAN sort of like ranks sup vis-a-vis our friends in other parts of Asia. Well, not to mention the OECD countries. We've got our work cut out, and I think the view taking going forward ought to be with respect to the government's will, or political will, rather, and that has to be backed by a very strong fiscal space. The rule of thumb is, for every dollar that needs to be spent on any infrastructure project, the government should be spending a quarter to a third of that, and the rest should be by the private hands.
But are they spending enough? Because the average spend in Southeast Asia by governments on infrastructure is below the Asian average.
Sure. I mean, like whatever yardstick that I've mentioned, not only the portrait of where we are vis-a-vis all the other countries in Asia, but what we're spending is not as high as where it should be. Take a look at Indonesia, more particularly. Our logistics to GDP ratio is the highest in the world vis-a-vis some of the more developed economies in Asia, much less the developed economies around the world. I think it's around the range of 20% in terms of the cost of logistics, and that is attributable to the fact that the infrastructure is just not adequate. We've got to spend a lot more, and I think we can't just be thinking of the tens of billions. We've got to think of the hundreds of billions, if not the trillions, in the next 10 to 20 years. The question is, are we going to have enough fiscal space? And the answer is we do. Now, I think with that space, given enough political will, given the right regulatory framework, I think we can start getting things moving the right direction more so than ever.
Hamish, do you think there is enough fiscal space? Because what statistics show that actually the amount of money spent on infrastructure lending projects last year declined by about 6.3%.
I don't think the constraint is lack of liquidity or the fiscal constraint. I think the issue is the risk allocation and this, if we call it this public-private partnership, how do we actually develop a model that deals with all the risk across all the different sectors to give the certainty to the investors to get their return over a sustainable period. And everything we're talking about here is not 1 or 2 years. All of us have mentioned decades and a very long-term vision towards a sustainable, productive future. So for me, the key is really the model, is an equitable model that shares the appropriate levels of return and risk between public and private partnerships.
John, is that something you can agree with, that risk is the problem, the distribution of risk? And is there only kind of one kind of model in private-public partnerships, or what would you?
Well, I think that public-private partnership is a term that people tend to define a little bit differently. At its heart, though, I think you have to assume that if you're going to attract private capital to invest in a public infrastructure project, you have to be prepared to deliver the investors a certain return. And for a public company, it's roughly equivalent or over the weighted cost of capital. And if you can't do that, then you're not going to attract much private capital, because that capital's got to go where the shareholders think that they can get a reasonable risk-adjusted return. And so it really starts with that premise. And I think if you can solve for that, then you have companies like ours and others that are quite prepared to do business around the world, even in places where you might see a higher risk, because it's a business we understand, it's with partners that we know, so we take a different view of the strategy behind the decision. But you got to really wrestle with the fundamental question: is can you give a return, provide a return that allows the private capital a reasonable risk-adjusted return?
Shahril, what has your experience been?
I would like to echo what he said, but I'll give an example. Yeah, if we look in Malaysia, the development of marginal oil fields, where we were able to fund it. Yeah, we were able to fund it by the banks, basically. We were able to raise a bond based on the certainty of hydrocarbons in the ground, and that the project will yield a certain return. Without knowing that you will get that yield, you will not get the financing. So in that way, the policy was to allow some sort of a cap. I mean, the risk is guaranteed by the company, and the banks were willing to accept the risk because the company was in a consortium that had track record of developing these fields before. The subsurface was studied by an independent company which was endorsed, and that risk was internalized by the financiers, and the financiers then gave us the money to develop the project of now almost $1 billion. So again, it's the legal infrastructure, the way you would find innovative ways of financing those kind of projects through non-traditional approaches to the securing of risk.
Stephen, everybody's talked about some of the kind of there's cheap money available for infrastructure projects. There's a need for infrastructure development. From your experience, is it actually just the lack of finances which is impeding infrastructure development, or is it the non-financial hurdles which are much more important, like the regulatory framework, the legal framework that you talked about, and multiple layers of governance in countries like Indonesia?
The short answer to the question is yes. I think that the challenge that the region faces is one of this risk point that John has made, but it's also a lack of instruments for intermediating the excess savings that exist within the region, and we refer to this as the infrastructure financing paradox that exists within Asia broadly, but specifically within ASEAN. I mean, ASEAN right now, you have some $700 billion of foreign exchange reserves, and you have an unmet demand of $60 billion of infrastructure just in ASEAN alone. So unless we can figure out instruments and mechanisms for leveraging against those excess savings, right now those excess savings are invested in low-yielding treasury securities in the Eurozone and in the United States. So we need to figure out ways that you can leverage that money, much as the other panelists have said, to make investments at appropriately risk-assessed investments in the region.
Gita, do you think the governments are doing enough, and have they got it right? Because when you choose an infrastructure project in which you want to invest, what is your primary motive? Is it actually to gain revenue, or is it to actually job creation, or to help the maximum number of people benefit from it?
We're not in a government to gain revenue. We're in a government to serve the public, right?
That's a politician's comment.
That's what they call me, the public servant. But look, you've got ASEAN with around 10 kilometers of roads on a per 1,000 person basis, about 0.25 kilometers of railroads on a per 1,000 persons basis, about 75 to 76% electrification rate, relatively good quality of water availability. Telephony, the fixed line yardstick is not, I think, accurate in giving the right picture because of the mobile telephony, and that has allowed us to circumvent the impediment. Now, I'm not a proponent of the argument that the money is an issue, but the fiscal space is an issue. I've never been worried about whether or not there's enough money out there to fund the building of roads, railroads, ports and airports and power generation capabilities. But the private guys are not going to go in if they don't see the government getting its act together. Now, the government
has made a couple of mistakes in Indonesia. You've had this swanky new airport.
That's probably an understatement, but nobody's perfect. But look, I think the view forward is that we have recognized what our shortcomings have been, and the important thing is directionality. Guys like John and Shahril and Steve and Hamish are not going to look at Indonesia if there is no macro political stability, if there is no macroeconomic stability. And I think we can check off those two boxes today, tomorrow, and a few years thereafter. The ratings are improving. And all we've got to do is just that we've got to put money on the table from the government. For a long time, we didn't have that ability because we were indebted significantly. We have trimmed down our debt. Now we can start thinking, okay, let's put more money into education. Let's put more money into infrastructure. Before, when we started having more money, we couldn't do it as easily because the regulatory framework was not ready. Now it is more ready than ever because the land law is out. It tells and defines the extent to which or how long you're going to have to wait to clear land and how much you got to pay. That's a defining moment, not only for the government, but hopefully for the private sector. Now, all the stuff that John and the other guys have to do is just wait, okay, this guy's been talking, but is he putting money to work?
Exactly. That's what I want to ask
If
them.
in a year or two we would have built better airports or more airports, ports, and power generation capabilities, I'm quite sure the money will come because there is tons of liquidity out there.
But when? That's the question. So I want to put this question
again,
to John.
coming from ASEAN, I'm a student of gradualism. We've just got to be patient.
You see, but time is running out, and so we have to find out. I'm going to ask John. Indonesia is obviously making quite a bit of an effort from what the minister says.
Yep.
Is the story of Indonesia replicated across Southeast Asia? Are governments doing enough in terms of infrastructure regulation, in terms of uncertain land rights?
I don't really know how to define enough, but governments are doing more. And I think the point that Gita made, more and more governments understand, it's complicated. There are trade-offs that go with all of this. I mean, economic development, infrastructure development doesn't come for free, right? And it doesn't come without making trade-offs. You have to choose, you have to make choices about power sources. You have to make choices about transportation. You have to relocate people to build new roads and railroads, and that comes at a little bit of a price.
But that is the conversation going in the right direction.
I think it absolutely is.
But,
because
Amrita, if I may just add, okay, almost a couple of years ago, John and I were having a drink in Honolulu. He was just boggled and bogged by how slow things were. And I told him to be patient. And guess what? Value unleashed a couple of months thereafter. And guys like GE and the big companies around here, they get the big picture. And all they want to see is directionality. Right. And I think Indonesia has been able to prove directionality.
I think that's exactly right. And we're not looking for risk-free investments. We're looking for reasonable clarity, a level playing field, and a stable governance structure. We understand as an investor, you have to take risks. So it's not about that at all. It's about exactly the points that Gita made. And when we see that, we are prepared to invest, and we're doing that in Indonesia and other countries in Southeast Asia.
Well, one of the risks the region does face is actually the lack of adequate electricity, or what they call energy poverty. Shahril, if you want to kind of add your comments on that. By 2015, the ASEAN Economic Community is supposed to come in place. Energy integration is an important element of that. How far have they got there?
I think the conversation is progressing well. Again, you know, I have to underscore the issue of trade-offs. Different countries are at different levels of development, and prudent use of policy to drive the delivery of energy to the right place, and the transportation of energy to the demand where it's at is a complex one. You know, if you were just to use a straight line capitalistic model, you'd say just let's send it where the demand is. But you do have to send energy to where the demand is not yet, and to ensure that those areas come up. Because in the end of the day, if you stretch the time frame another 30 years, those are the areas that are going to need that energy. So you have to start now. So you need to have a longer term view on this, and it's not a 3-year, 5-year, it's more 15 to 25 years. This area is probably going to be, some of the figures I see, maybe 44% of the world's GDP in 25 years.
But ASEAN has set itself a deadline, and that's one of the deadlines is 2015, and the other deadline is 2020 for an integrated energy system. Stephen, how much work needs to be done? We heard from Shahril, it's not an easy solution, long-term planning. But do you mean to say they will not then be able to reach the target they've set themselves for 2020?
I wouldn't say that they're not going to meet the target, but I think there's a lot of challenges ahead. I think you look even beyond that, and aggregate energy demand is expected to increase in the region between 3 to 5% on an annual basis. So there's meeting that demand, creating the interconnectedness that's necessary in order to meet that demand on a sustainable basis. But there's other questions of, as you see that kind of increases, what is the sustainable energy mix that we can put in place? And right now, if we stay with the mix that we have, coal dependency is going to increase by more than 50% during that same time frame. So we need to be looking at the demand side, we need to be looking at the supply side, and making sure that we're making investments that are going to be sustainable in the long run. I'm not saying in any way that coal isn't going to be part of the solution. It will be part of the solution, but we need to be looking at addressing energy efficiency. We need to be looking at sustainable sources of generation as well.
And Hamish, I mean, at the moment, I think 74% of the energy in Southeast Asia is derived from fossil fuels. What could a new energy mix look like in this region?
I don't think it's too much what a new energy mix should look like. I look at obviously the huge supply that's coming on board with LNG and thermal coal, and I think the base load in this region, it's appropriate that it comes from the fossil fuels at this stage. And as new technologies come in, with GE, we're doing a wind farm in Mongolia at the moment. We're doing them in Australia. It's getting the mix right, but we really need to focus on the base load at the moment. Energy is the foundation of infrastructure. It what stimulates infrastructure, and we're seeing this huge move of urbanisation through the whole region is just going to increase the energy demand. So whether that's 50% or 100%. The reality is that it can be met with today's technology.
In fact, GE is very involved in providing some of the solutions in Myanmar, where we are now. 74% of the people have no electricity, right, and 84% in the rural areas.
And I think, to the point that Shahril made and others, it's the fundamental building block for a standard of living change and economic development. You can, if a nice road passes in front of your house, but you don't have electricity, you don't care so much about the nice road, right? You can't do much without electricity in terms of reaching all the people. So for a company like ours, we've had to reshape how we think about power generation and look at much smaller, more distributed methods, because we know that the grid won't get everywhere it needs to go and reach all the people it needs to reach. And I think all of the companies that are attending this economic forum have had to alter their view about how to deliver products and technology and capability in places where there are basic needs to be met.
Shahril, how can the basic needs be met from your perspective in a country like Myanmar, where the poor have absolutely no access, the rural poor to energy, the urban poor have very limited access to energy? We take certain things for granted in the Western world. You press a switch and the light comes on. You know, you turn a tap on and there's water. But these are things which are completely uncertain here in this country.
Well, you know, not just this country, but all countries that are similar. Yeah, even Malaysia at one point. I mean, there are resources. Yeah, and those resources will be extracted. As I mentioned before, you know, in the extraction of those resources for energy, there's opportunities for capacity building also. And again, those resources will also be exported, and some of the revenues coming from those resources will have to fund social projects. Because at the end of the day, you have hydrocarbons in the ground that belongs to the country. Some of it has got to come to development of social infrastructures. I mean, there's no other way. The equation is quite fixed.
Stephen, I want to just stick with Myanmar for a bit. I mean, you know, we are on this kind of moment in the country when it's opening up to the world. There has been a lot of investment interest in Myanmar. But Aung San Suu Kyi, the leader of the opposition, warned against a frenzy of investments and talked about the need to be a little more cautious in the kind of development that Burmese leaders decide to go in for. What is your assessment of the situation?
Well, I think that's essentially correct. I mean, one of my greatest concerns about development in Myanmar is there's a lot of challenges, and we know those well. They've been articulated by many, including ourselves. But I think that the one great challenge for the countries is that of expectations management. Expectations management both on the part of foreign investors, but expectation management perhaps even more importantly on the part of the people of Myanmar. There's huge expectations for dramatic and speedy change that are not going to be met. It's going to take time. I mean, there will be change. I'm completely convinced that the government is committed to this reform process, but it's going to take quite some time. And I think that this is why when we talk about resource extraction, it's critically important. And I agree entirely with the fact that we need to be making investments side by side in social infrastructure, in off-grid electricity supply, in education and health. And if we don't see those investments happening in Myanmar alongside necessary resource extraction, the future is not as bright as it might otherwise be.
Now, Gita, we've seen that you as a politician, your country's been through various stages of development. There are other countries in this region, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. They've also had to make changes. Looking at Myanmar, what would you wish for the country? What would you caution them against? And what would you say that they should need to do as they open up to the world?
Well, actually, I had a discussion with Aung San Suu Kyi last year, and some of the stuff we talked about related to the stuff that you've just observed. Until about a year and a half ago, I was the chairman of the investment board in Indonesia, and I was very careful about not overselling, over-marketing Indonesia. And it's always useful to tell everybody from within and beyond that, there's still corruption in Indonesia. There's still bureaucratic deadweight in Indonesia. That we're not as educated as some of our brothers and sisters and friends in Singapore and Malaysia. But the important thing to note is Indonesia going to be less corrupt 5 years from today or 10 years from today? Is Indonesia going to be less bureaucratic? And, I would encourage them to take a view. And the facts are that, in 2009, FDI was only about 6 billion US. And last year, we had $25 billion US worth of FDI, and FDI has been growing at 25 to 30%. The fact remains that 3 to 4 years ago, the United States was not even in the top 15. Now they're in the top 4. Korea was nowhere in the picture. Korea is now the second or third largest investor in Indonesia. And the good news is they're putting money to stuff that matters in the long run. And that's not just coal mining, oil and gas, and all that good stuff. It's stuff that's being put into manufacturing, services, agriculture, and whatever that I think will help Indonesia move up the value chain.
Indonesia is already moving in the right direction from what I can see, Gita.
Yeah.
You're very much the flavor of the year. And if I had my way...
I think Myanmar is the flavor of the year.
That is true.
Congrats to our friends in
At the
Myanmar.
international scale, I always think that Indonesia is very kind of ready to join the BRICS, and actually should be called BRICSy.
Yeah.
With Indonesia as the
well,
eye at the
I've
end.
had my debates with Jim O'Neill, but it's we let the others choose as to whether or not we belong to that group.
I want to touch briefly on a point that you made about the frenzy in Myanmar before answering your other question, because I think if it's a frenzy, it's not going to serve the nation well. And the government can't absorb a frenzy. The decisions can't be made if it's a frenzy. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that it is a measured approach. I think the other point is that the government, this fledgling democracy, 60 million people are waiting to see what benefits democracy will bring. And they have to see benefits. So there are going to be some trade-offs that have to be made, because I don't know that they're going to wait 5 or 10 years to see those benefits. They're going to need to see some benefits soon and some benefits over time. And I think all of the companies involved and all of the institutions involved in this process have to respect that fact. That will require trade-offs too, the balance between short-term and long-term. And if we all get this right, there is no reason to think that the people of Myanmar can't benefit just the way people in other ASEAN countries have benefited from good governance, democracy, investments, and a better standard of living.
Yeah, the important thing is, of course, is responsible investments, because one of the things Aung San Suu Kyi said, that people are already getting impatient here, that it's in the third year of reform, and they're asking for basic infrastructure, basic things like roads, water, electricity, health, education. So you're right, it's also a problem about high expectations.
Well, I think so too. Let's face it, democracy is not perfect. There are democracies that have been around for hundreds of years that don't always operate the way people would like them to operate. I think you have to give a lot of credit to the amount of change that's taken place here in a relatively short period of time. People without electricity want electricity, and if you don't have it, you're impatient. So I get that. But this has been tremendous progress in almost overnight in the context of democratic evolution.
I'll ask Stephen, one of the talking about the frenzy, since that has become a bit of an issue here. Apparently, one of the ministers reportedly said that he's meeting so many international delegations of investors that he has no time to actually think about what he should be doing. What are they offering? What should I do? Is this the person to invest in? Are you worried about that there is this kind of scramble for a rich nation with poor people for resources here?
No, I think that's exactly correct, and I would include ourselves as a representative of the donor community that we contribute to the problem as well, where we I think suck up some of the bandwidth as far as the ministries are concerned, and it's a challenge we've seen over and over again in many emerging economies where the capacity in the government is very, very limited. So the number of people that you can actually see that know what's going on is relatively limited. So I think that what we need to be doing collectively is exercising restraint, self-restraint, which we're not necessarily that good at, but it's encouraging to hear John emphasize the importance of that. But also, I think, is finding ways that we can invest in building capacity within the government and within the institutions in the country so they can actually serve that demand. The demand's not going to go away, and there's going to be interest in this country for a long time to come. But getting over this hump in the immediate term is going to require restraint on the part of investors, restraint on the part of donors, but also us finding ways that we can help support the government in making these things happen over the short term.
ASEAN is a wonderful organization. You work very well together. But there's also underlying surface. Are you also competing with each other as countries when it comes to infrastructure? Because there has to be connectivity at an infrastructure level.
You should have attended the session this morning.
Okay.
Look, earlier, John and I were together with Kishore and a few other prominent people. It was a fascinating discussion about where ASEAN is and how we're surviving. I think it's important to underline that we're a different kind of union by way of history and legacy vis-a-vis some of the other unions that we're seeing in other parts of the world. And I think we're there to last. It has been miraculous how we have turned out, from a geopolitical, economic, and social and cultural standpoint. And I think it's going to last. Yes, Singapore is going to have to do whatever they have to do. Malaysia is going to have to do whatever they have to do. Indonesia has got to do whatever we've got to do. And I think the next 20 years, it's all about making sure that we've got the supply side of the equation ready. And it's these guys out here who can help us in terms of creating and availing the supply side.
Right, thank you very much.
I just want to add one point. It's not just the frenzy in Myanmar. I feel like I don't have time to think nowadays.
Okay. And that's because I think you should be a BRICSy. That's why. Now, I thank the panelists very much for their comments. Obviously, we couldn't raise all the issues that we could have raised and wanted to raise, but we have time constraints. May I now invite the audience to pose their questions? The gentleman there. If you would wait for the mic to come to you.
Good Bullock from Accenture Development Partnerships. There's been a lot of talk about PPPs and public-private partnerships here in infrastructure, very interesting conversation. But what about private-private partnerships? And I'm thinking particularly where, rural electrification meets agriculture, meets telecoms. And is there an opportunity for the private companies to get together in a more integrated approach to drive both economic development but also the social development that Myanmar needs?
I'd just like to add that probably about 80% of our order book in Asia is actually private to private. So, whether it's the mines that we're working on or, casinos in Macau, the tourism sector, bottling plants for Coca-Cola in Indonesia, factories for Caterpillar. So the bulk of the work that we do actually is private investment coming in. But where the deficit sits at the moment, which is what we've been focusing on, is harnessing this public-private partnership will fund the deficit.
But also to go back to the point earlier about legal and regulatory frameworks and how critical those are in order to realize, whether it be public-private partnerships or private-private partnerships, but also I think policy on the part of governments in terms of determining that this is indeed a priority and this is one thing that they want to align themselves behind. And so again, there's much to be done.
I'd echo that too. Going to new areas, we always try to work with companies that add value, on a private basis. On for example, in Brazil, we go in with Seadrill, with another company to address that market. In Malaysia, indeed, for development of oil fields, we are in with another company called Petrofac, and you get a sharing of capital, a sharing of risk, and also the sharing of expertise and capabilities to execute the work, which gives the financiers the confidence to come in and fund those projects. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have a question there from a gentleman in the white shirt.
Mingalawa. My name is U Wing Wu. I'm a member of parliament from Yebu constituency. Well, we are very proud to host a forum like this, and you are welcome to our country. What I would like to ask for is, what would you like to wish for our people of Myanmar, or any message that you want to give to us? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for welcoming us to your country. We're all very happy to be here. And I think this is a message maybe everyone can say a word.
I don't mind starting. I think one of the few things that made us the way we've turned out was that there was a military reform that took place before real political reform. And that's, I think, the step that you guys are taking here already. And you can learn from not only our successes, but our mistakes. And, we're only 15 years into the game, and there's more to come. But definitely, Indonesia could be a model for you to take a look at.
I would agree with that, and I think that there's a real advantage that Myanmar potentially has as a second mover, if you will, to look at both the positive stories and the negative stories from the region and move ahead in that. And I think one thing I would underscore is just the importance of equality and inclusiveness when it comes to growth. One thing that we've seen over the region over the last 20 years is we've seen tremendous amounts of people moved out of poverty, but a lot of that has been in China. And so there's been a gap that's been growing between the rich and the poor across the region. and that is something that foments social instability. It foments all sorts of different things that you don't want. So you need to be looking at both the top end of that growth. You have to be looking, importantly, at the bottom end of that growth as you move forward.
I think the one thing for me is looking forward. If you look back and you try to reflect on the past, and you can't, you can never put that behind you. But the challenge will be to unite on a common vision for the good of the nation, and that's and then tap into all the lessons learnt around the region, because you're certainly not alone in the journey that you're taking, and there's a lot of interest that you succeed.
My wish is that people will see the benefits of democracy, understand that there needs to be some trade-offs in order for those benefits to keep accruing, and that this process will continue to develop. And if you think about the Indonesia analogy, there were probably people 15 years ago who were predicting it might not work, it's not moving fast enough, there isn't the right benefit being spread around, and those things get dealt with over time.
I'm a little bit cautious to recommend any cookie-cutter solutions for the running of a country, because every place is unique, and every place have their own issues that they have to deal with. Therefore, look at all the systems that are available around, and understand how those systems fit best to your own needs and your own pace of development.
Well, that brings us to the end of this session. Powering growth through strategic infrastructure in Southeast Asia. That was the focus of the World Economic Forum DW debate, coming to you from Naypyidaw, the political capital of Myanmar. I thank all the panelists for their great contributions. I thank the audience here for being attentive. And I thank all of you, whoever you are, wherever you may be, for being with us on this wonderful occasion. I had a great time. I hope you did too. Bye-bye.